Bart Johnson, a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Oregon. I'm delighted to be with you here today to talk about a city landscape approach to regional sustainability and climate resilience. Not all of you may know where the University of Oregon is, or in fact where the state of Oregon is. In fact, many people in the US have no idea where the state of Oregon is. So for you, here's a map. You can see that Oregon is one of 3 states on the west coast of the United States. We are north of California, south of Washington, and I'm right about in the middle of the state from north to south, and at the southern end of what you'll see later is called the Willamette Valley, perched between the Coast Range and the Cascade Range. So the organizers asked me to talk about urban-rural linkages, and this is the vehicle I'm going to use, talking about a city landscape approach with the ideas of regional sustainability and climate resilience. My talk today is divided into 4 parts. First, a conceptual framework for city landscape sustainability. Next, I want to talk to you about the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Research Hub. Then go into some of the Hub's recent activities and accomplishments, and then provide a personal research example of some of my work that really bridges between cities and their surrounding rural landscapes. The first part is the conceptual framework. Pretty simple in one sense. There's just one slide here. So when we were thinking of the hub, envisioning it, this idea of the connections between cities and their local and regional landscapes was at the fore to differentiate our efforts from those of a lot of other folks working in urban sustainability. The idea here is to focus on 4 sets of processes. Those internal to cities, as indicated within this boundary and meant to indicate where the city is and the processes that go on within the city. Those occurring within surrounding rural landscapes, as indicated by these larger arrows on the outside. And then those occurring across urban-rural boundaries, indicated by these arrows pointing between the city and the rural landscape and back into the city again. And then finally, telecoupling, the transfer of goods and services that connect cities to distant landscapes and economy. So within this basic, very simple framework of cities, their connections with local and regional landscapes, we then try to understand the cross-cutting issues and dimensions. For instance, the processes and couplings here in the left represent spatially situated interactions among key productions, for example, food, water, and energy, each with their own topologies of social, ecological, and economic networks. So what we have here are multiscalar interactions and feedbacks. They're dynamic in space and time, and over time, they can drive shifts in boundary locations as cities expand. Next, the hub itself. So how do we act on that core metaphor, that core idea of the relationships between cities and their local and regional land? Well, I have to start out by talking a bit about the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, or APRU. It's a network of 60 leading universities linking the Americas, Asia, and Australasia. And the Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub is one of the APRU's 9 primary research programs shown on the left. One of the reasons the APRU is such a good home for us is that its goals are not just research for the sake of knowledge, but to create action as problem solvers and as agents of change. The mission of the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscape Hub is to advance the sustainability of human and earth systems through co-production of knowledge that leads to actionable plans for enhancing supportive relationships between cities and their local and regional landscapes. As a group, we've developed a set of guiding principles through our International Steering Committee. The first is that we seek broad geopolitical representation across the Pacific Rim. This is geographic, cultural, socioeconomic, and ecological. We need this diversity to be able to learn from each other so we can craft the best local solutions, but also because for sustainability to be achieved, it has to be achieved globally. Second, we have different understandings and context for sustainability. The Hub provides an opportunity for us to explore these differences not only in conceptions of sustainability, but in how their unique geopolitical context leads to different approaches and goals. We seek to understand common issues and their unique contexts and solutions. Third, we will address the needs of underrepresented communities and vulnerable populations. In particular, we want to contribute to the alleviation of poverty and inequality within and among countries, with a particular focus on marginalized populations and places that may be most exposed to the challenges we face today. Next, we recognize that climate change is a grand challenge for human societies and Earth systems. Human societies depend on a variable but relatively stable climate system. Climate destabilization now poses a key threat to human societies and to the ecosystems upon which we rely. Finally, we want our work to be transformative, and we will be dissatisfied if it isn't. We are a research hub, but our inquiry is intended to lead toward on-the-ground change. This requires both intellectual leadership and the engagement of stakeholders, practitioners, business, government, and NGOs. We began the hub in 2017 with 8 member universities, and since then we've expanded to a total of 19 member universities arranged around the Pacific Rim here. You can see our locations arranged across a map of the Pacific Rim of fire, of volcanoes and earthquakes. You can see we've developed fairly good representation from South America, Central America, North America, Australia and New Zealand, and then up through substantial parts of Southeast Asia. We are continuing to expand. The University of Philippines Los Baños is one of our recent core members, and Professor Jennifer Amparo serves as our International Steering Committee member. All of our activities, however, are open to everyone from around the world. I want to start and talk about just a few of the Hub's activities and accomplishments over the last 4 or 5 years now. We have held a number of annual conferences. In the first 3 years, we had one in Portland, Oregon, then Hong Kong, next in Sydney. And the heart of our conferences is our focus on working groups. It's in this venue that we develop our co-production of knowledge from our members sharing with each other. Working groups are organized in advance of the conference by invitation and solicitation. They do work before the conference, but then really use the conference as a time to come together, put together a product such as a paper that they're going to work on, and then share those ideas with others in the hub to get feedback and collaboration, begin to weave together the ties of our ideas and thinking. Each conference also has something special. Hong Kong had a design field school. Sydney had a design competition and advocacy workshop. The working groups are fluid. They change each year. Some have held since our first conference and continued in each subsequent conference, and others have emerged over time. You see here, though, from the Portland conference, the diversity of topics that people are addressing, each of which has components of urban processes as well as linkages to rural communities. Some are more focused on dense urban areas and some more on the rural counterparts. But the entire idea, again, of the hub is to emphasize the linkage between urban and rural landscapes. In 2020, we were scheduled to have our conference in Auckland, New Zealand. Something called COVID-19 got in the way, and we shifted to a virtual platform. It had its disadvantages, but it also really allowed us to focus on bringing in more people into the conferences, and will probably continue in a hybrid venue from now on out. At the Auckland conference, we both had a PhD symposium, but we also brought in new working groups around Indigenous knowledge and wisdom, and thinking about responses to COVID-19 with a particular focus on how it would affect the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. This year, in absence of a conference, we've held a series of webinars. In fact, we're still in the middle of it if you'd like to join any of them. You can see the list here. All the ones that have occurred so far are recorded and available online, and we still have a total of 4 more coming up between now and February. And there's a link below for you to find out more about these webinars. Our work with the United Nations Mayors Academy is an example of how we are serious about wanting to make our work transformative. So since 2019, a group of SCL faculty have been actively contributing to the Asia Pacific Mayors Academy, partnering with the UN and UN Habitat and other international organizations to work with mayors to support accelerated city-level solutions and peer-to-peer exchanges to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. It's clear that climate change doesn't know boundaries, and as a hub, We have crafted a declaration of climate emergency and call to action, which focuses on 4 key dimensions of the climate crisis: ecological foundations of life, how do we protect Earth ecosystems, ecological processes, global biodiversity, and evolutionary potential as the foundation of life's resilience and adaptive capacity. The rights of future generations. How do we act to ensure that future generations have access to the conditions needed to flourish, including natural resources such as healthy air, water, fertile soils, and cultural support systems that provide security, education, healthcare, shelter, and fulfilling livelihoods in supportive communities. Climate justice, because marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Specifically, we need to address their vulnerabilities and needs and actively engage these communities in resilience and adaptation planning and implementation. And finally, and centrally, this idea that cities are embedded in landscapes. We want to shift from a tendency to think of cities in isolation of their environments to a conception of continuous landscape mosaics comprised of all landscape types interacting with one another, the hydrosphere, and critically, the atmosphere. Excitingly, we have completed a milestone that is now in press, is the Routledge Handbook of Sustainable Cities and Landscapes in the Pacific Rim. The handbook has been a venue through which we have collected and are disseminating much of the work of our first 3 conferences, as well as bringing other papers from authors around the world. The handbook includes over 60 case studies across the Pacific Rim, with 64 chapters contributed by 116 authors and 38 institutions from across the Pacific Rim. It'll be coming out soon, and I encourage you to look it up, and many of the chapters will be available online as free access. The rest of the handbook then is a bit of a cost. Finally, for the rest of my talk, I want to present examples from our research that investigate how cities can interact with their surrounding landscapes to weave together biodiversity conservation, food security, wildfire risk management, and carbon sequestration. Or at least that's what I said in my abstract. Each of those is separate projects, but what I want to focus on instead is some of the connections, the connective tissue between these projects, because really, just like thinking about working groups or cities as a whole, all these issues interact with one another, and it's critical that we craft solutions that build bridges across them. You heard me argue that one of the pillars of meeting the climate emergency is protecting the ecological foundations of life. By that I mean, writ large, biodiversity and the processes that sustain and renew a resilient ecosystem metabolism, locally, regionally, and globally. Quite simply put, we experience a resilient ecosystem metabolism as life's abundance upon which we depend and through which we thrive. Every place on Earth has its own exemplar of such cycles of abundance, but here in the Pacific Northwest is the way that the salmon, through recycling their own bodies and streams when they spawn, created watershed fertility so great that they say you used to be able to walk across a stream on the backs of the salmon. What if sustainability were understood as the careful management of life's processes of abundance? When I began my research to protect and restore biodiversity, it was largely due to my belief that humans had an ethical obligation to share the planet with other species who live here. Over time, that perspective has broadened to encompass the ways in which human health and well-being depend on biodiversity, and it's deepened as I realized that these 2 perspectives, intrinsic values of nature and ecosystem services that benefit people, were in fact 2 sides of the same coin, that we're part of the planetary web of life. My longest standing research has focused on what some call Cascadia, defined on this map by the watersheds of the great rivers that drain from the western mountains to the Pacific Ocean, a land of Mediterranean summer drought and rainy maritime winters. The watershed on the right is the Willamette River Basin. The circle shows where I live in Eugene, Oregon. You can see the high Cascade Mountains to the east, the lower Coast Range to the west, and notice the flat green valley and foothills that stretch more than 150 kilometers to the north to Portland and to the Columbia River on the border with Washington. Remember that flat, dark green area and its shape when I switch to the next slide. There are many dimensions of Cascadian biodiversity, including our old-growth forests and our dynamic salmon-bearing rivers and their floodplains. But until a few decades ago, one of the lost memories was that much of the lowland Pacific Northwest, including the Willamette Valley floor and foothills, were prairie and oak savanna grasslands in what is now mostly a forested landscape. You see here a map of the Willamette Valley Ecoregion, the valley floor and foothills from 1850, reconstructed from General Land Office survey maps that show the valley was dominated by upland and wetland prairie, oak savanna, with wide stretches of riparian gallery forest as much as 6 miles wide and small areas of wetland. The gray areas then were the only forest that was found in 1850. Here we are in 2004. Almost all of those grasslands are gone now. In fact, they've become conservation targets for Oregon habitat strategy planning. Well, what were they? They covered nearly 2/3 the valley floor. They were dominated by grasses and by different wildflowers. We have remnants of these ancient ecosystems, but they're mostly gone. Even though these grasslands were mostly herbaceous species, their sparse trees grew to large sizes with deep full canopies for birds and arboreal mammals, while producing plentiful acorns and pine nuts for elk and deer. What maintained these biodiverse grassland ecosystems before the arrival of European Americans? And why did they change so rapidly? It's not simply a matter of curiosity. These prairie and oak savanna grasslands support a large number of plants, animals, and insects that occur nowhere else in the grassland, in the landscape, including a number of federally listed species. You see here the numbers of vertebrate species associated with the grasslands. Over 714 native plant species, of which more than 391 are found principally or exclusively in grasslands, and over 11,000 species of arthropods and insects, including nearly 400 species of native bees that specialize, some of them, on one plant or one genus. Today, 80% of those bees are likely extirpated or extremely rare. Well, we have a few records, visuals of that time, such as this painting by the artist Paul Kane in 1846, showing wide expanses of grassland there. But what made those grasslands in a landscape that can easily turn into a forest was fire, and at least one of the agents of fire were people. In this case, we see a native Kalapuya man there. The Kalapuya set fire for a wide array of reasons, including immediate effects of hunting, gathering seeds, collecting grasshoppers, and deferred effects, basket material, bulbs and tubers, nuts and berries, deer habitat, and tobacco cultivation. And in fact, what European colonists came here and thought was a wild landscape wasn't so much a wild landscape as a cultural landscape, where people were, in the words of Cat Anderson, tending the wild. They were managing oak savannas in very sophisticated ways over not just hundreds, but thousands of years. And in the process, they created amazing works of art and of utility, such as these baskets and hats that were created with bear grass. So I think that the care and attention and sophistication we see in their processing of grassland goods and services was likely managed by that of their management activities, including the use of fire. So what happened to all that grassland? In a nutshell, about 44% of it was converted to agriculture by European American colonists because it was flat, productive soils. Another 44% converted either to forest or other natural vegetation because in the absence of wildfire, both the lack of indigenous ignitions and the active suppression of fire by Euro-Americans led to conifer succession. Forest became to dominate those grassland systems. About 8% of it was converted into built features, residential lands and urban areas. So in 150 years, 90% loss of that land that remains, the 2% that remains, about 90 to 95% is on private land. Savannas are extremely dynamic in space and time. Unless they're buffeted by disturbances such as fire, they tend to change rapidly into something else, closed canopy forest or dense shrubland. So, as I said, these savannas of the Willamette Valley were apparently a cultural landscape maintained by millennia, by people. If not managed to maintain savanna, they will change into something else. And most remaining oak habitats, as I said, on private land, so they can't simply be set aside by the government for conservation. So let's take a step back and think about how we might restore them, but also why. we talk about the different ecosystem functions and services of these oaks and grasslands. First, they regulated fire regimes. They were resilient to disturbances, fires, and floods while maintaining ecosystem metabolism, their productivity. They sequestered they sequestered carbon in their soil. They provided pollinator resources. They had hydrological functions of water quality and flow regimes, maintaining them. They were breeding and feeding habitat for diverse wildlife. And clearly they provided goods and services to people, including food, firewood, recreation, aesthetic, and spiritual values. So could we return these functions and services to the entire landscape? Is it possible? If so, how? In the recent years, there has been development of a Willamette Valley-wide strategic action plan for the conservation and restoration of oak and prairie systems. You see here on the map on the right, I've noted what the cities in tan, the small areas of conservation reserve in red, and then look right around Eugene and notice how the city is ringed with conservation reserves. Well, it's clear that conservation reserves aren't enough to protect these systems. And in fact, they certainly aren't enough to restore the services, the ecosystem services that were spread across much of the valley by these grassland systems. What can we do? Well, part of the good news is there have been studies now that show that even individual remnant oaks, like this one shown here in somebody's rural yard or in the middle of a pasture, can act as keystone habitat structures that provide critical resources for species that wouldn't persist otherwise in agricultural fields. So we can gain some of those habitat values in agriculture by just leaving a few oaks intact. We can begin to do things like creating Vineyard Certification, habitat-friendly, ecologically sound production, as you see here under this Willamette Valley Ecoregion. Can we support and restore state-listed acorn woodpeckers like you see caching their acorns here in such vineyards? We're finding out. But that's the countryside. What about the city? Do Oak Savanna and Prairie have a role that makes them valuable beyond their biodiversity value? Eugene's Rivers to Ridges plan says yes. It provides recreation value, hiking trails, nature enjoyment, and education, leading from outside the city into the city. You see here the idea of blueways along rivers and greenways along habitat trails. That trail system has been now part of a purchases by the city and by other state agencies to create a long trail system of over 20 miles of trails that projected to go to 60 to 100 miles of trails to connect habitats, people, and cities in the region. You see here their working vision for a plan that has now been largely implemented. And we see that fire is being introduced in and around cities to restore biodiversity. On the left, in my hometown of Eugene here, and then on the right, you see active fire burning actually going down in a fairly settled area of a park in the middle of Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's not just on public lands we can do this. There's certainly potential for residential prairie yards that have beauty in them. This is my house and my yard. And you see here some of the just the beauty and the enjoyment that we've created by making habitat in our yard. So what if residential yards supported abundant wildlife and mosaics of native ecosystems? How much biodiversity might we bring back to the city? And not just biodiversity, but enjoyment. Single-family residential yards comprise the majority of land in most of the U.S. cities. What would it take for such a movement to take hold if enough landowners' yards to make a difference? So biodiversity is a good thing, but what else would motivate urban and rural residents to protect Oak Savanna and Prairie wildfire? How can we connect intrinsic values to ecosystem services for nature and people? Well, wildfire has become a major motivator. The answer lies in understanding how when these grasslands, in the absence of fire, begin to fill in to dense forests, it changes the types of fires that will burn through them. Going from these low severity fires with very short flame lengths that tend to leave most of the trees intact and don't damage the ground layer, to catastrophic forest fires that leave nothing but death in their wake. And one of the best ways to do this is through the reintroduction of fire into the landscape. So a lot of work is going on to figure out how do we bring fire back into the landscape to restore safety for residents. We've seen over the last decades now what happens when fire gets out of control. It's California, Greece, Australia. And in the last 2 years on the west coast of the U.S., absolute catastrophe has occurred. So a lot of planning effort now is going into how we plan from the rural areas through what is called the Wildland-Urban interface, where houses are interspersed with wildland fuels, right down into city areas where we have had cases of entire towns burning to the ground and fires coming into cities. But we've also had extensive health issues from smoke that can blanket a region sometimes for weeks at a time. In some of our work, we've conducted simulation modeling, where we've actually explored different alternative future scenarios to understand how we can control the size of the wildland-urban interface through growth management. You see here simulations of everything from Oregon's current statewide land use policies that control sprawl to what happens when we release that. And then we take those different scenarios and we put them into simulation models that begin to examine the interactions and feedbacks between development, you see housing density on the left, between people doing treatments in the landscape, thinning forests, restoring oak and savanna and prairies, and then the changes in vegetation on the right, ranging from forest harvest to occasionally see large wildfires occurring in our simulations of future wildfires under climate change. Here we freeze the model in 2054 to examine an 8,600 hectare wildfire that until this past year would have been the largest to occur in the area over 100 years. This example is the embodiment of anticipating future surprise in order to avoid its consequences. One of the key challenges then is to help people anticipate changing risk at larger spatial extents and longer time frames than their daily lived experience. This is particularly difficult when risk is moving outside the bounds of past experience. Last year, the Holiday Farm Fire just outside my community of Eugene burned 170,000 acres, over 10 times larger than any fire recorded in Oregon's Willamette Valley since the early 1900s. It destroyed over 750 structures. All told, the 2020 Oregon wildfires burned over 1 million acres and destroyed over 4,000 structures, almost all of them homes. We learn by trial and error and through accumulated experiences. We make decisions and plans that mediate between opportunity and risk. How do we reasonably anticipate a future unlike anything from past experience? So in addition to our simulation modeling to support anticipatory planning efforts, we've also begun working retroactively with landowners who lost their homes in the 2020 wildfires, helping them understand how they can recover their homes and valued lifestyles while changing their landscapes to better meet the needs of the future is shown in these illustrative axons on the left and a comparison of a hazardous pre-fire forest to a fire-resilient and climate-adapted woodland that creates not just a landscape but a home for them and for their children. I want to wrap up here with a discussion of an even larger project that we've been working on recently, looking across the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, to understand how what we call natural climate solutions that are based on helping sequester carbon in the soil and in vegetation can help us draw down excess atmospheric carbon and contribute to mitigating climate change. And you see on the illustrations here that we have to apply these practices across the entire landscape, all uses, understanding how we optimize across these different landscape types and how we create ecosystem services and benefits for people under all situations, including supporting vulnerable communities. A lot of this ties back then to the Wildland-Urban interface. You see here again this idea of the WUI, the Wildland-Urban interface, where houses are adjacent to or interspersed with wildland fuels. How do we control that? Because on the one hand, in terms of carbon, when cities sprawl, they take over productive lands that can store carbon and they replace them with pavement. The second issue is that as we sprawl and put more homes into these rural areas, it makes it harder and harder for us to implement fire, prescribed fire, to control future risk. because of the proximity of homes to smoke and to the possibility of an escape of a fire. This is not a small area. Here you see a map of the Wildland-Urban interface in Washington, Oregon, and California. It's nearly 10% of the land area in the U.S. and 1/3 of all our houses. From 2000 to 2013, the WUI accounted for 69% of U.S. structures lost to wildfire. You see here some simulations in a modeling system we call Envision that shows under different future scenarios the possible change in extent of urban areas in blue in the map from our current conditions to controlled growth to high urban expansion, all with the same population growth, but really controlling urban growth, because that blue area is just urban. It doesn't even include all the WUI, the Wildland-Urban interface that's created around it. One of the answers actually takes us back to where we started full circle. The importance of Indigenous fire stewardship in the Wildland-Urban interface and beyond to both reintroduce and reinstate prescribed fire as a way to support Indigenous culture and to harness their deep knowledge of the land to creating safety and supportive places for both people and nature. I'm going to end where I began. I do want to acknowledge the many colleagues and students with whom I've learned and grown on a journey of hope and a lot of hard work over the last several decades, and return to this simple conceptual diagram of the relationships between cities and landscape, and of a city landscape approach to regional sustainability and climate resilience. Thank you very much. Good day.